Hi class, so this week's readings focused on the social construction of gender and sex. So to start off, we read a couple of public sociology pieces about the social construction of sex and gender. These articles touch on a lot of the key terms and concepts and ideas that are really foundational to understanding how sex and gender are socially constructed. So to start off, the XX and XY article really worked to debunk essentialist ideas about sex and gender. So the author highlighted how people make essentialist assumptions about sex by equating maleness and femaleness with genitalia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it matches chromosomal makeup. Sex is a lot more complicated than just people's genitalia. It's not always just male or female, and in fact, there are a lot of folks who are born intersex. So intersex is a broad category of people who, for one reason or another, this could be chromosomal makeup, hormone levels, or what those folks' genitalia is, they don't fit into the category of either male or female. And actually, in fact, a lot of these folks are given surgeries when they're born, especially if the sort of ambiguity of their sex is related to their genitalia. They're often given surgery to fit into one of those categories. And sometimes this has been done without parents' knowledge or consent. I think that probably happens a little less than it used to, but oftentimes children would be taken from their parents and given surgeries to correct their sex without their parental consent or knowledge. So both the XX and the XY article and then the other sociologist article touch on the following key terms that you all should know after this week. These are all really important to our conversations around gender. So the first is cisgender. And so cisgender describes people whose assigned sex at birth matches with their personal gender identity. So a person who was born and assigned female and then who also identifies as a woman. Transgender is the next term that you all should know. So transgender folks are people whose personal gender identity does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So for example, someone may have been born and assigned female at birth, but then as they grow and they age and they sort of think about themselves and their gender identity, they may identify as a man. And so there's a discrepancy between what their body's designated as and then how they feel their gender identity is and what they want their gender identity to be and how they would like to be perceived as others. There's a lot of narrative around this like born in the wrong body language that encompasses a lot of transgender conversations. And while that's a good place to sort of start, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Like we talked about sex and how sex is more than just male and female and it can be more complicated. And so a lot of trans activists are actually trying to move the conversation to talk about, well, how do we associate particular body parts with maleness and with femaleness? Like, are those inherently men's body parts or inherently women's body parts? How can we sort of think about bodies differently and less about like it being the wrong body and more about letting people talk about their bodies and exist in their bodies in the way that they feel most comfortable. The other important term is non-binary. So non-binary folks are people who identify outside of the gender binary. These folks might also identify as trans or transgender. Those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. People take on and identify with different identities. So for example, someone might come out as transgender and start to transition either by taking hormones or maybe by getting surgeries. But then sort of as they move through thinking about their gender identity and being more open about it, they might realize, hey, wait, maybe I'm actually non-binary, or like maybe I don't actually fit into either of these two potential categorical options. So there's a lot of, I would say probably like flexibility is the best word that I have within the LGBTQ community, where folks are able to think about their gender and assign terms to it that feel the best for them. So you're also assigned a chapter, the chapter on doing gender. So that also resonates with the XY and XX reading, and discussing that sex assignment has very little, if anything, to do with identifying as a particular sex or gender category in everyday life. So essentially your sex assignment is very much meaningless in relation to what your gender might be. There are different things, they need to be thought about differently. People often will say, well, they are associated with particular body parts, but what a lot of folks are trying to push back on is that, well, if we complicate sex and we don't think about sex as binary, then these body parts don't necessarily align. Like, there are plenty of women who have had to go through breast cancer and have had to get surgery to remove their breasts. Does that make them any less of a woman because they don't have their chest anymore? And similarly, if a woman is a trans woman who was assigned male at birth and decides to transition and become a woman but can't afford to have breast surgery or can't afford hormones, does her flat chest mean that she's any less of a woman? So we're really there in the queer community. There's really a lot of work around sort of rethinking how we associate bodies with sex and bodies with gender, and sort of trying to push back against notions about how those two things work. So through interaction and actions, people's gender categories are revealed to the world. And a lot of you in your discussion posts this week in the open discussion, we're talking about how you don't really think that you do gender. And I think that that's actually really important to think about for cisgender folks, because they don't necessarily have to think about how they do gender, right? You get up, you put your clothes on in the morning, you get in your car, you go to work, you go to school, you go to your social gatherings, like you go to the gym, you go into the locker room that's assigned with what matches your gender identity. Like, these aren't thoughts that you have on a regular basis, but through choosing what you wear, through walking into a particular locker room, through engaging in particular activities, you are doing gender. It's just not a conscious, intentional act, the way that it might be for someone who's transgender or non-binary, who has to think, which locker room can I go in and be safe? Which bathroom can I use and be safe? Like, these aren't thoughts that cisgender people necessarily have to have on a regular basis in order to remain safe in their environments. So the Doing Gender chapter also highlights the ways that gender depictions are not essential sexual natures or categories, but instead we convey these things through our performances, and it's sort of a socially scripted dramatization. And Judith Butler in that video describes as a performative act. So this sort of means like actions, like how we dress or describe ourselves to other people, the types of spaces we enter, like a women's restroom or a men's locker room. These are all actions that constitute a gendered performance that other people in the world will read. And we only have so much language and so much ways of being to describe different gender identities. So when I say that it's a socially scripted dramatization, we've only in the last probably, I would say about 10 or so years in the US, other cultures have other gender identities outside of male and female. I'm talking and thinking specifically about the Western white context. We have a lot more language now than we used to, but still we're all kind of constrained by the social settings that we live in. And so gender then becomes both interactional, so how we interact with people, but it's also institutional. So it's interactional in the way that we perform and through our actions and the ways that other people assess that gender and develop ideas about what it means to be masculine or feminine or perform masculinity or femininity. And then it's institutional in the ways that we reinforce these essentialist notions of gender through things like having separate bathrooms or separate locker rooms for men and women. Like, why do we have those? What is inherently different about going to the bathroom that means that we have to have these two separate spaces, right? Why aren't all bathrooms gender neutral? Why are not all restrooms have stalls? So men's rooms obviously have urinals, which is something that a female assigned at birth person might not really be able to use because of the way that their body is. But like, why does that have to be the case? Like, why can't all bathrooms have stalls so that people just can use a toilet? Why do we need to have separate toilets for men to urinate in versus women? So just kind of thinking through the ways that these like institutions actually reinforce that there are these essential differences. So we need to go poop in different places because we poop differently. Like that seems silly to me when I think about it. But I think a lot of these things we take for granted. So the reading from the book, Dude, You're a Fag, touched on masculinity in particular and the ways that boys in high school perform and reinforce ideas of masculinity. And it highlights different types of masculinity, including hegemonic, subordinate, compliant, and marginalized. You should all be able to define and explain these types of masculinities from these readings. So if after doing that reading you're still confused or you haven't gotten to that reading yet, be sure that you read through it and understand what these differences are and can define them. I'm going to briefly just discuss hegemonic masculinity, which is the one that's probably discussed the most frequently of the different types. So it's masculinity that explicitly supports gender inequality. So men who engage in this type of masculinity think that women and other gender-identified folks, so folks who are trans or non-binary, are not equal to men. So men are better than women. Men are different than women. And so that's a really important distinction to make because I think that there's a lot of conversation around hegemonic masculinity, especially in media and in pop culture, that's like not totally accurate. Because just because a man doesn't necessarily engage in feminism or feminist practices, he's not necessarily engaging in hegemonic masculinity unless he actually believes that men and women are not equal. So maybe he doesn't go to a women's march, but he might not actually think he's better than a woman. So I think it's like important to tease apart those definitions. So the author in this book explains how sexuality also becomes part of the masculine performance and it regulates social structures. So boys who are more effeminate have their sexuality called into question, right? So the title of the book, Dude, You're a Fag. So men or boys who are not being tough and rough and tumble, or who like act more femininely or like enjoy doing something like theater or something like that, are stigmatized and thrown into a category and taunted and teased and called names like fag. Masculinity isn't only centered on the male body in this book, but it actually highlights the ways that this masculinity can impact young girls, and particularly girls who are thought of as more masculine than other girls. So like the tomboys is a popular phrase for these types of like more athletic maybe, or just more domineering, in some cases lesbians. They're actually given, interestingly, more respect because they're showing these masculinities, which I think is really important and interesting to think about. So I hope that these readings were able to highlight some of the ways that sex and gender are more complicated than just binary notions that are systematically taught to us and what we're socialized into. Spend some time this week thinking about the ways that you perform your identity in your daily life. I like to do this with students, like think about how the clothes that you're putting on your body matter when you're going to work or going to school. Like, what do those signify? Critique the clothing. Think about, why is clothing gendered? Clothing doesn't have a gender. Clothing is just something that covers us up so that we're not naked in public, right? How are clothes shaped differently? So how are women's fitted clothes shaped differently than men's? Athletic clothes especially. Like, when you're exercising, you just want to wear something that's like comfortable, that's not going to chafe, that's going to like keep everything like comfortable while you're like running or lifting weights or whatever. So why are potentially men and women's workout clothes so different? Are there any sort of essential reasons that might be the case? The other thing that I like to do is like walk through your local pharmacy store, like a CVS or a Walgreens or a Rite Aid, whatever it is, and look at all of the gendered products. This will definitely come up in the meme discussion. There's one, I think it's quite funny. One of the memes is sort of related to this idea of like why we're gendering products. So like men's Q-tips versus women's Q-tips. What does that mean? why do we need different Q-tips? And then also compare prices. Look at the prices and the differences between the men's products and the women's products and see if there is a difference. If not, that's great. If there is, think about why that might be. I hope you all enjoyed the readings for this week. I really enjoyed reading through your discussion posts. You all are really getting the concepts and the notions of social construction and how that's important for how we think about gender. Feel free to email me with any questions or concerns that you have. I look forward to reading all of your discussions about the memes this week. I think there are some pretty funny ones. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with me if you need anything. Have a good rest of your day.